Rabbi, Rabbi Fishman, thank you so much for the kind invitation and for this opportunity to learn Torah together. As I always mention, we haven't had a siren in a while, but I'm here in Modi'in, Israel, and if God forbid there should be a siren, I'll have to go into the bomb shelter and reschedule from there or reattach from there, but we should be okay. So as Rabbi Fishman mentioned, this is a bit of a sad thing that we have to deal with this issue. But at the same time, precisely because it's so grave of a matter and so serious of a matter, it's very important to gain a certain amount of moral clarity on these issues. And it's hard to know where this war is going to take us right now. But in general, I'd say that the ability for us to build up our fortitude, not just physical fortitude, emotional fortitude, but moral fortitude, is critically important as the war progresses and as accusations fly about the ethics of war. And it's super important for us to be familiar with this topic. And in particular, one of the things I want to focus on this evening or this afternoon in Montreal is this idea that religion is a source of violence. Okay, that you might say, well, you look at Hamas, they're clearly fundamentalists of some form or another. You can define them one way or another. And there's obviously other factors there. There's nationalism. There are other factors, of course, going on. But religion certainly plays a role in their violence. And one of the questions we have to ask is, in general, does religion, does Torah in particular, which is our particular concern, of course, teach us to be particularly violent and to fight unlimited wars? And because one of the hallmarks of contemporary military ethics is this notion of limited wars, which means that we impose limits on the way we fight for ethical reasons, sometimes for political, conventional reasons. And the question that we want to ask is the Torah sympathetic, or does the Torah side with this notion of trying to limit wars with a particular eye for the question of casualties of non-combatants? Sometimes this is called civilian casualties. It sounds a lot easier to say. It's a little bit tricky to use that term civilian casualties because when we have asymmetric warfare and you have people who aren't wearing uniforms who are fighting, so you sometimes have people who are civilians who are fulfilling combatant roles. So, but when I refer to civilian casualties here, I mean to non-combatant casualties. Obviously, this is an issue of grave matter. Israel, of course, is very upset, rightly so, that on October 7th, many of our non-combatants, many people were killed and murdered and raped and kidnapped. And the question becomes is just in general, do we have to care about this issue of non-combatant casualties? And what I want to try to argue right now is the answer of the Torah is yes, there is a concern for trying to minimize non-combatant casualties, okay? And I want to try to develop this as we go along in our discussion right now. Let me just pull up then our slideshow and we will take it from here. Okay, by the way, Rabbi Fishman, just to clarify, Halachic Organ Donor Society, my organization, has transformed now to Eimatai, right, which is dealing with a whole bunch of issues, organ donation, of course, included. But our focus right now, this is in general of Eimatai, is the intersection between ethics and practical ethics and Torah. So Eimatai generally deals with medical ethics. Of course, tonight we're going to be focusing on military ethics. And I'm going to focus on the issue today of forewarning. Okay, of the notion of saying that we should warn people before we go to war in order to try to remove the civilian casualties from the area, with a particular eye to how this might apply in the cases of sieges. Now, Israel isn't exactly have a siege right now in Gaza. It hasn't from the whole start. For starters, one side is controlled by the Egyptians, of course. But beyond that, certainly things were entering Gaza throughout. I think it was a big mistake, actually, of the defense minister to call it a siege when they never were imposing a siege. Raises a lot of issues. But that's going to be our focus right now in general of what we might learn, what the Torah has to say about siege warfare. And these are ideas that are going to be drawn from my book, Ethics of Our Fighters, which is already available for pre-sale from Maggid Books and should be out by the end of December. So on a beginner journey right now, in 1982, July 1982, 1 month into the Operation Peace of Galilee, later known as the Lebanon War, later further known as the First Lebanon War. And this was the first time where Israel really had to grapple with the issues of urban warfare and with collateral damage and civilian casualties. And the reason is fairly straightforward. In 56, 67, war of attrition, 73, Israel, I don't want to say it was demarcated battlefields, but it was pretty clear who we were fighting. The battlegrounds were more or less, right, in terms of military areas. It was clear we had armies in uniform, soldiers in uniforms fighting against each other. Once we get to 1982, once we get to the fight against the PLO terrorists led by Yasser Arafat in southern Lebanon, things get tricky because these are terrorists who are not fighting with uniforms, and they're fighting with no rules at all, and they're fighting within civilian confines, within urban settings, and you raising the questions of human shields. And so Israel's now at this point in war for about a month. It's slowly made its way up Lebanon and Lebanese coast. And in the beginning of July 1982, Israel, if you see these soldiers lined up here, lays siege on the city of Beirut. And the man on the bottom right, then the Ashkenazic chief rabbi of Israel, but most famously, the first chief rabbi of the IDF, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, drops an ethical bombshell of his own. And Rabbi Goren says it is forbidden, according to Jewish tradition, to lay siege on the city of Beirut. That is to say, you can have a siege, but you cannot hermetically seal the city. You've got to leave what he calls the fourth side open. Now, that doesn't mean let people in, but it does mean that you have to let people out. There has to be some form of evacuation corridor to let people out of the city. And because he's a chief rabbi, this raises a bit of a brouhaha, and he gets a response, many responses, including one by the man on the top right, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, one of the other very, very prominent religious Zionist poskim of his era, member of the Chief Rabbinic Council and the Rosh Yeshiva of Merkaz Harav Yeshiva. And Rabbi Yisraeli tells Rabbi Goren, this is not true whatsoever. There's no such formal obligation. You can't fight a war if you leave and have a siege and leave the fourth side open. Quick show of hands, those of you have your screen on, how many of you think Israel followed Rabbi Goren? And how many of you leave the fourth side open? And how many of you think Israel followed Rabbi Yisraeli? I'll just leave it there as a question for you to think about, which we're going to come back to as we go along. Now, what I want to understand before I get back to this question is, where does Jewish military ethics come from? Because if you think about it, we didn't have that many wars that we were fighting, had responsibility for about 1,800 years. And therefore, the amount of literature you might think that we talk about military ethics isn't that great. But in fact, as I try to show in my book, is that there actually is some discussion, a quite extensive amount of discussion, and interesting discussion, a little bit inchoate, but a certain amount of discussion in which we can learn principles of Jewish military ethics when fighting wars of self-defense. And I want to sort of lay out some of these principles, which I think you'll understand more or less, right? You know, have a feeling for where they come from, because I think they give us a bit of a sense of the key factor of military ethics. And I think of Jewish ethics in general, is that we're always going to be balancing different values. There's always going to be this question, right, of we have certain values, they sometimes conflict with each other. How do we balance them, or how do we decide which one takes precedence in a certain case? So we know that that the Torah believes that all humans were created in the image of God, that we believe in the dignity of mankind. We therefore say that it's inherently wrong to illicitly kill someone. Thou shalt not murder, right? And then part of the parcel of that is that when we do have to kill someone, we only want to kill the people that are responsible, right? Individuals bear primary responsibility for the actions, and they should bear ideally the sole weight of responsibility for their actions. And we always keep in mind when killing that we don't want to overkill, partly because we have a vision of world peace. And it's very important. I always remind myself of this now. Excuse me, when Israel is facing a very brutal enemy, that's always important to remember that we do aspire for an era of world peace. After all, we learned this from the Isaiah wall, which comes from, of course, the book of Isaiah, in which we're told they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. And we should always keep this in mind, friends. I think this is always something which should be in the back of our mind, that we want to minimize warfare. We don't glorify from warfare. And therefore, we have a number of principles which try to limit war and the damages of war. However, if you look in the book of Micah, the book of Sefer Micha, which has the parallel exact same words from Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares and so on. 8 verses later, we are told, I will give you horns of iron and provide you with hooves of bronze, and you will crush the many people. That is to say, it becomes clear that we understand that at times warfare is necessary to bring justice to the world. Warfare is necessary to defend oneself. Warfare is necessary to settle the homeland. And indeed, if you look in the book of Genesis, we read a few parshiot ago, we see very early on, Abram goes to the land, and soon afterwards, what does he have to do? Go to war, right? And so part and parcel, there's a certain recognition of the reality of war in order to eliminate evil from the world. And it's important to understand that warfare is a collective matter. Okay? It entails citizens and soldiers endangering themselves for their nation, a willingness to kill individual members of the enemy nation. Warfare creates a form of communal identity and responsibility. And unfortunately, the nature of war is that is going to encompass individuals who might not be in that war, but nonetheless, they are encompassed within the collective identity of their people. And because of that, we, of course, are going to have partiality to our own. Our primary responsibility is going to protect our own people. And I want to say something here, which is going to be very important as we go along. Defending your people, right, and winning wars isn't just a matter of national interest. Of course, it's part of our national interest, but it's also a moral imperative, which is why it bothers me so much when people sometimes present military ethics as, well, there's a balance between humanitarianism on the one hand and military necessity or victory on the other hand. No, military necessity and victory is also a moral imperative. Right? And that's why I place these on the same sheet, because it's not like one is interest as opposed to morals. No, you have competing moral values in a given situation. And part of what we're trying to do is to protect our collective. That is part of the goal of why we go to war. And it's one of those things which I think we see in the Torah is very encouraging of, meaning in Deuteronomy, again, Sefer Dvarim, when we're told we're going to have to go to war, and the Kohen comes out to war, he tells him, Chazak ve'amatz, right? Let not your courage falter. Yoshua, when he goes out to battle, right in the beginning, Chazak ve'amatz, be strong and resolute. In other words, there's this understanding in the Torah that we're going to need to fight, and fight well, and fight courageously, and win. And winning is a very interesting issue, and I think this is one of the most interesting issues of warfare, is that there's a double-edged sword of what you might call national honor. As with all actions, the honor of both God and his people is a factor, because we do not want to disgrace our reputation by behaving in an unethical manner, but we also do not want to disgrace ourselves by being downtrodden, by being murdered, raped, killed, and pillaged. That too is what you might call Chilul Hashem, as Moshe Rabbeinu tells God, Lama Yomru Hagoyim. What will the nations of the world say? Right? There is a moral imperative of making sure that Jewish blood isn't perceived to be cheap. Okay? And so you're going to be balancing these ideas in general. And there's no doubt, however, and this will have to come to, is that it would seem that even though all of these principles, seem to be well-founded, the Bible seems to have very bloody warfare and accepts it with equanimity. So if you look in Sefer Devarim, right, Deuteronomy 25, Perachafei, we learn the story of mitzvah of wiping out Amalek. Like lo tishkach, blot out the memory of Amalek. Now, I want to say something here. It's very important to say it. It is crucial that we not think that we fight like we fight the Amalekites. Okay? Amalek doesn't exist anymore. The Rambam says the same thing about the 7 Canaanite nations, and therefore there is absolutely no halachic imperative whatsoever today in order to wipe out any nation. Whether if they could call themselves Amalek, they could put the Amalek symbol on their flags. It doesn't matter. Right? That notion of fighting like we fought the Amalekites no longer exists today. However, the idea of needing to blot out evil, of course, is very, very important. And it's retaining that balance, which is precisely our dilemma tonight. Because on the one hand, we understand we need to blot out evil. We need to destroy evil from the world. We need to destroy that which is threatening us. At the same time, we don't want to fight like we once did against Amalek. And that is part of the balance that we're going to see tonight. And of course, there is a general, besides Amalek, if you take a look at Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, we have there Vaitzbu Midian, the fight of Midian. And you remember, Moshe says, the Jewish people go and they kill the men. Moshe comes back and says, you kept the women alive, right? And that was the case with the women that caused the sin. And we're going to come back to this passage because once again, we seem to see that the Bible accepts bloody warfare with equanimity. However, if you take a look at Sefer Devarim, Perek Chav, where we first learn about the warfare, the rules of war, and this is probably the most explicit place in the Torah in which we learn notions of war. Here you see in the bottom right, artistic rendition of siege warfare, of the siege warfare of Yoshua. Yoshua is known to have laid sieges on Ai and other cities as well. And it's not surprising that the Torah, the one real explicit limitation on warfare that the Torah teaches us is that we should, when you lay siege, do not destroy its teachings. When in your war against the city, you have to besiege it a long time in order to capture it. You must not destroy its trees. After all, are the trees, right, able to withdraw before you into besieged city? Meaning the trees are not guilty at all, don't have what we might call a scorched earth policy. Okay? Now, it's not surprising in my mind that sieges is precisely where the Torah introduces limits to warfare, because that's a common form of warfare. It's one of the most ancient forms of warfare. And what I try to argue right now is that the Jews know siege warfare well because we're on the losing end of siege warfare many, many times. Okay? And this is where it's going to get significant, because what I'm now going to try to argue is that in this balance of values that I brought up earlier, I think that there is a clear attempt to try to balance these values by limiting the amount of civilian casualties through the processes of forewarning. We have trying to clear non-combatants out of the area. And I want to show you where I think this idea might come from. So we know that the Jewish people suffer from sieges. Okay, we learned this in both the First Temple period and the Second Temple period. And by the way, the fall of Beitar and the Bar Kokhba rebellion in the 2nd century CE. All three great destructions that are commemorated on Tisha B'Av end with siege warfare. And so let's take a look at what happens during the First Temple. And the description of it is found in the second book of Melachim, but is most explicitly brought down in Sefer Eicha, in the book of Lamentations, where you see the suffering of the Jewish people. By the way, we still commemorate today the suffering of a siege with a fast day. Anyone know the name of that fast day? Asara B'Tevet, the 10th of Tevet. It's pretty wild. Why do we have a fast day on the 10th of Tevet? After all, we have other fast days for the breaking of the walls, and we have another fast day of the destruction of the temple. But I think the rabbis understood that the siege itself, which began on the 10th of Tevet, was a horrible and horrific moment because it led to this, as we're now going to read, where the city becomes debased, and even the jackals, right, would suckle their young. But Jews at this point are poor people. They've turned cruel. The tongue of the suckling cleaves to the palate for thirst. Little children beg for bread. None gives them a morsel. The people are now just digging or even dying, depending on how you understand what it means here, in the garbage heaps and the refuse heaps. Right? People's faces are blacker than soot. They can't even recognize themselves, let alone each other, because their skin has shriveled on their bones. It is dry as wood. They say that it would have been better for people to have died by the sword than those slain by famine. Right? A very graphic description, which ends with the story of tender-hearted women killing and cooking their children to consume their flesh in order to survive. So you see how bad it can get during a siege. And this repeats itself not only during the first temple period, but in the second temple period. And we know this from Chazal, we know this from the book of Josephus, the Jewish trader, then Roman historian Josephus. And he tells us similar stories about a siege and women killing their children. And the Romans outside, this is about 70 CE at this point, hear about this story. And some of them could not believe it. Some of them pity the distress which the Jews were under. Others just said, what do I care? It's just the Jews. And they brought the question to Caesar. Caesar, do we have responsibility, moral responsibility, for what is going on, for the suffering of the non-combatants, of the women who are eating their children? And Caesar excuses himself before God to this matter and says, I propose peace and liberty to the Jews. What did I say? You give up your practices, you can live, right? But you chose the Jews' sedition. You could have had peace, you took war. You could have had satiety and abundance, but you chose famine. Meaning, what is Caesar saying? You didn't have to fight this war. You could have surrendered. From the fact that you chose this war, once we went to war, it's all on you. The moral responsibility of the suffering of the civilians, of the non-combatants, is on you, Jews, and therefore he can go to God and say, I am not guilty. Is this true, friends? Is this true that just because once you go to war, you have no responsibility for the suffering of others? So if you look in the Torah tells us, again, this is similar to the place where we saw earlier. It tells us when you approach a town to attack it, you shall offer it terms of peace. The Rambam says this is a rule no matter what, whatever type of war you go to, whether it's a war of self-defense, war of conquest of the land of Israel, expansionary war, it doesn't matter. You always offer peace. Now, it's interesting. Was this so obvious? So the Medrash Tanchuma says no. It wasn't obvious because God had just said, right, go and destroy them. And Moshe Rabbeinu, according to the Medrash, turns to God and says to him, how can I just go and smite them? If I go and just wipe them all out, I do not know who has sinned and who has not sinned, meaning I do not know who is guilty against me and who is not guilty against me. I don't want to go to war until I try at the very least to avoid killing those who haven't sinned against me. And what does God say to Moshe, according to the Midrash? By your life, so will I do. Meaning the law then will be, no matter what, you shall offer terms of peace unto the city. And the motivation here is very important. The motivation is, I really don't want to go to war when I haven't at least tried to avoid a situation where I'm inevitably going to kill people who haven't sinned against me. Now, Caesar could have said the same thing. I offered peace. Right? But once they rejected it, just go kill them all. But what is interesting is that we have this really amazing law that comes up in the Sifri and is taught by Rabbi Natan in the 2nd century CE. And Rabbi Natan tells us that when it says in the Torah they warred against Midian, that pasuk that we saw earlier on, right, the bottom right here, and Bamidbar Lamed Aleph, Vayizvu Midian, right, they did exactly what it said, right, and they killed all of the men. So the Midrash says initially that means they laid siege first on all four sides. But Rabbi Natan says, no, no, no. They left the fourth side for them to flee from. Is that the words of the Torah? How does Rabbi Natan know this? But nonetheless, the Rambam codifies this rule and says, when a siege is placed around a city to conquer it, it should not be surrounded on all four sides, only on three. You should leave a place for the inhabitants to flee and for all those who desire to escape with their lives. As it is said in the Torah, and they besieged Midian as God commanded Moses. Is there anywhere in that verse where it says to leave open the fourth side? Of course not. And so the Rambam says that the Rabbi Natan must have known this mipi hashmua, from a tradition, from a story, some form of Mesorah is what made him say you have to raid the siege as described. Fascinatingly, the Ramban Nachmanides, a century later, goes and says not only this is a law, it's a mitzvah. And the mitzvah teaches us something. Now, we should let people flee. From here, we learn two things. There are two motivations behind this law. One is that we learn from this to act with compassion, even toward our enemies at the time of war. In other words, this mitzvah of Rabbi Natan is teaching us when you're fighting war, contrary to what Caesar said, even after you go to war, you should try to show some form of compassion and get people out of there. And it's interesting, the Rabbana also says, beyond the humanitarian logic to it, there's also a military logic, because let's think for a moment. Suppose you are in a town that is besieged. Is there any reason not to fight? I mean, after all, you're being besieged, you have nowhere to go, you can't flee. And so you have every incentive in the world, right, to fight because you got nothing else to do. But if you allow people in a evacuation corridor, if you allow them to leave, then it might cause people to say, I don't want to give up my life fighting with this town. And that makes the town all the more easier to conquer. And so there's a military and strategic benefit to this idea of leaving the fourth side open. Now, I looked around, and indeed, Rabbi Shaul Lieberman, in his Sefer Tzedek Pshuta, notes that you find this strategic idea in some writings of 1st and 2nd century Roman strategists. I mean, most said we just lay a hardcore siege around the city, but some do add and say this idea there's a military advantage. Is that where Rabbi Natan learned this idea from? It's possible. It's always possible. But it's hard for me to really imagine how this 2nd century sage, who lives at the time of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, is necessarily being influenced by Roman strategic thinking. And I suspect, but cannot prove, that Rabbi Simcha Cohen of Dvinsk is right, that this notion of leaving the fourth side open comes from the obligation of offering peace. Because he says the Ramban held the view that just as it's a commandment to seek peace, so too it is a commandment to leave them aside to flee so they can save their lives. In other words, if you believe that you don't want to go to war because you don't want to kill those who haven't sinned against you, so too that even once you start the war, even once the war began contra Caesar, we're going to do things in order to minimize the harm to those who haven't harmed you, to those who haven't sinned against you. And I suspect, I can't prove, but I suspect that Rabbi Natan, who knows very well of the suffering of the Jewish people by sieges in the first temple and in the second temple, and in the fall of Beitar and the end of the rebellion of Bar Kokhba, which he lives in that time period, might have said, if the Jews ever get power again, show a little bit of compassion towards the enemy side, even during the time of war. And so now I come back to where we started from. And here we have our great debate in the siege of Beirut 1982. Remember, Rabbi Shlomo Goren, bottom right, says, leave the fourth side open, leave an evacuation corridor open. And Rabbi Yisraeli says, that's not how we fight war, right? These weren't bona fide laws. They didn't apply to Clement mitzvahs, all sorts of ways of getting out of this. Who do you think we follow, the IDF? Rabbi Yisraeli or Rabbi Goren? Who thinks Rabbi Yisraeli? Hermetically sealed, four sides all around. Who thinks Rabbi Goren? Leave an evacuation corridor. All right, tipped my hand. You're right. But it's amazing that most people think that this law is totally impractical, and yet what ends up happening is Israel actually leaves an evacuation corridor, which allows approximately 100,000 people to flee the city during the 2-month siege. And Rabbi Goren cites this as a great Kiddush Hashem, that the IDF showed compassion on the enemy's side. Now, at the end of the siege, we have a situation where about 14,000 PLO terrorists leave, some during the siege and some afterwards, when the American government negotiates a ceasefire and lets Arafat and many of his men leave the city. And let's look at the numbers. Now, the number game is always difficult. I mean, this is going on today as well. Who's reliable, who's not reliable? In the first Lebanon war, the head of the Lebanese International Red Cross was none other than Yasser Arafat's brother. Not quite the most reliable figure, impartial figure in this battle, in this warfare. Things continue today with having unclear how reliable the numbers are. But we seem to think, this is based on a book by study of Richard Gabriel, called the Book of Operation Peace of Galilee, an American analyst, who said that he thinks about 1,000 PLO fighters, and we know 88 Israeli soldiers died during the siege. Now, how many non-combatants died? So we think it's about 5,000 killed, another 20, 30,000 wounded, with 100,000 people fleeing the city. Now, you can look at those numbers and say, well, that's a lot of people. I mean, there's still a lot of people, a lot of casualties, a lot of wounded people. But that is part of the tragic human tragedy of the war. The question is, was that unethical? Right? Was that immoral in fighting in an urban area in asymmetric warfare against a terrorist group that was fighting amongst the civilian population? Is that an excessive amount of casualties? And I want to show you what was written a few years later, and this always takes time to do the proper evaluation, by one of the lead lawyers of the International Red Cross. Right? He writes about this in 1987 and says as follows: the Israeli bombardment of Beirut resulted in high civilian casualties, but not necessarily excessively so, given the fact that the military targets were placed amongst the civilian population. That is to say, there's nothing disproportionate to the numbers of people. And the reason why is that they let them flee. They forewarned, and this allowed for many people to keep themselves safe. And in fact, two American historians, Dupai and Martel, in the book Flawed Victory, which I think is actually the best book on the First Lebanon War. So the two of them write as follows: as military historians, we can think of no war in which greater military advantages were gained in combat in densely populated areas at such a small cost in civilian lives lost and property damage. And this despite the PLO's deliberate emplacement of weapons in civilian communities. In other words, what Dupai and Martel are trying to say is that when you look at these numbers, you realize that Israel went well beyond the accepted practice and historical practice of doing what it takes in order to avoid civilian casualties. Now, the story gets a little bit complicated because in 1983, Israel has to lay siege again in Lebanon, this time in the further northern city of Tripoli, not to be confused with the Libyan city of Tripoli. And in the Lebanese city of Tripoli, there are Israel's on a couple of sides. The other side is being held by Arab enemies of the PLO, who actually think the PLO is not radical enough, because Arafat and his henchmen come back into Lebanon, and they're now under siege in Tripoli. And here, interestingly enough, Rabbi Goren says Israel does not have to leave a fourth side open. And so people say, wait a minute, last year you said they did. How come this year they don't? So one factor was that Israel wasn't controlling all four sides in the siege of Tripoli. As you recall, as I mentioned, there are other players that were laying the siege. But I think that what really comes into factor here is that in the end of the day, the fourth side open is less of a bona fide rule in my mind than a principle. Meaning, Rabbi Yisraeli has a point. It's not clear it always applies this rule. We don't really understand what the rule is. But the principles that we should always act with compassion toward enemies during war is an important one. Because just as we want to save lives before the war starts, so too we want to save lives during the war as well. And I think, and I'll then now take questions momentarily, but I think that this is a tremendously powerful lesson and example about how the teachings of the Torah, how this fourth side open rule can actually show how religion introduces the idea, not only religion, of course, but our religion can introduce the idea that not only before the war, but even during the war, we should do what we can in order to minimize civilian casualties. Now, as always with Jewish military ethics, this doesn't mean it's the only value. There are other values as well, right? There are other values that come into play here. And we need to balance the need, right, the desire to minimize civilian casualties with also our pursuit of winning the war, with also our partiality of protecting our soldiers as well as our civilians, right? With many other factors. So it's not that there aren't other factors here as well, but I do believe, and I do believe this is the way the IDF operates, is that there is an importance of trying to minimize civilian casualties when possible, to the extent possible. Right? And as we saw, this is, an important value, which I think we exemplified in the 82 war. And I hope and pray that we're able to continue to do today, even while we're fighting a war. And I want to end with a final phenomenon. There is no doubt there's extensive suffering in Gaza. There's no question about it. That is a human tragedy. That does not mean, however, that there's a moral travesty going on as well. Meaning the fact that there's a human tragedy of non-combatants dying doesn't mean that Israel is being immoral when it fights a war against a vicious enemy, which is literally, right, hiding behind or under, not behind, but under its civilians. And let's recall, the purpose of the fourth side open rule is to minimize civilian casualties. And here you have a case where the opposite side is hiding behind its own civilians, which inevitably is going to cause an extensive amount of non-combatant casualties, but that doesn't make it immoral, doesn't make it wrong. It makes it sad, but doesn't make it wrong by any means. All right, I'm going to pull up here right now, and we'll take some questions. Rabbi Fishman, I think it's a small group, so I think we just ask people direct. They can open up their mics and ask direct questions, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, 100%. Thank you.
Richard?
Yeah, I have a question. In this war, the IDF did not, as far as we know, did not say lay down your arms or we will attack. In other words, they came in without saying we're giving you whatever time to surrender. And give us your arms, and we are going to destroy your tunnel network. Otherwise, we're going to come in with our full force. Should they have done so?
Well, I don't think there's a luxury of doing so in this case. Because remember, already on October 7th, besides the fact that there are Hamas raiders crossing the border and killing ultimately becomes 1,200 people and kidnapping others, there is a launching of missiles against Israeli cities throughout the south, throughout the middle, here in Modi'in, where we had sirens and whatnot. So I don't think there's any really opportunity for that in this case, right? In terms of telling people, now I think it's pretty clear that Israel gave opportunities for Hamas if they wanted to surrender, right? They didn't go in right away with ground forces. That was pretty significant. And you could argue, I don't think this is what happened, but you could argue that forewarning has undermined in some ways Israel's military approach. Because we literally said for 2 weeks, get out of the north. We're coming into the northern Gaza Strip. Now, it may have been obvious that was what our approach was going to be, but it seems clear that they moved a lot of hostages out of the north. They moved their senior commanders out of the north, right? So we lost a certain amount of advantage there. And so, I don't think that Israel would have had that opportunity, but I think it was pretty clear. Hamas could have surrendered, right? They had that opportunity, but had no interest and was never going to do that. So, I don't think there's any obligation. And like I said, there is an obligation to try to forewarn in this case, but there are limits to what we can do. Meaning, ultimately, the responsibility goes on both sides to try to minimize casualties. And here we have this crazy situation where we feel like they're incentivized in some ways, in weird ways, to maximize or to not at least minimize their own civilian casualties. And this is a pretty crazy situation that we're dealing with Hamas. And so, I think we've got a very, very difficult situation here where at some point the responsibility really lies with the other side in terms of endangering their own people. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't still try to minimize civilian casualties, but it does mean that the onus moves upon another side. Further questions? Richard, were you trying to follow up there? I saw
Well, I am trying to follow up. Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, I mean, some commentators have written saying why blame Israel and Hamas and treat Hamas as if they don't have any moral agency. The cry is for Israel to have a ceasefire, but nobody says to Hamas, let go of the hostages, surrender, give us your armaments. Other and a lot of civilians are going to be killed, and it's going to be on your head. So one can say, well, Hamas was never going to do that. Hamas, as you said, really wanted the reaction that they anticipated, that the more civilian that Israel would strike back, civilians would not be targeted, but civilians inevitably would be killed. And the world would, as they have done, they would blame Israel for this and say so many, over 10,000 Palestinians have been killed, and only 1,200 Israelis have been killed. This is excessive. This is disproportionate. They misuse the word disproportionate as it's applied to warfare, as you know better than I do. But at the time, would you have advised Israel to say to Hamas, lay down your arms, or otherwise what's going to happen?
I think Israel more or less said that. I think it's pretty clear. And you're right. The fact that the world is unable to understand I don't say understand, but the world understands that Hamas initiated this. The problem is that the world has a skewed sense of responsibility and moral obligation when it comes to war, because there's this sense of, and I think there are a few different reasons for this. One is there's just a bunch of anti-Semitism out there in the world. I think we have to reality. But not all anti-Israel criticism stems from anti-Semitism, right? And so there are a number of different factors that come here. One of the big ones which comes in is this sense of, if there's a human tragedy going on, it must be the attacker's fault. Right? And so you look, or the strong person's fault, and you see destroyed Gazan buildings, and you say, we have to do something. This is terrible, right? The world is watching, to quote a certain prime minister, right? And, the world is watching, but the fact that you have sites of horror doesn't mean that Israel was wrong for it, right? Pictures don't tell you anything about moral culpability. And so this is a terrible thing that partly because of the CNN effect and social media and whatnot, but we have these pictures and we see this terrible thing, and the world sort of judges us in this way, which is just morally blind in some ways. And the third factor, and this might be the biggest factor, is that there is this sense of human rights that goes so far as to say that non-combatants never lose their immunity, to the point where you're responsible for making sure they don't die even through collateral damage. And that is just an ignorance of both the laws of war, frankly, but also of the ways of the world and ethics. At some point, there is a responsibility, which is not meant to be collective punishment, contrary to the head of the UN, but there's a collective identity and collective responsibility for one's people and for where we live. And this is something which we really can't avoid. And so this is something which the world has a very, very hard time grappling with. And it's very easy to, say that it cannot be, right, that it's justifiable to have this many civilians die, right, when you don't have to fight those people and live them on their borders. So, Richard, I'm sympathetic to where you're coming from and your frustration in the situation. But I do want to say, despite that fact, that doesn't mean that Israel should just ignore ethics because they're going to blame us anyway. We should fight the way we believe in fighting. That's a very important principle for us. Do I foresee IDF advancing south after the truth and no more hostages freed? It's a good question, Bridge. I do foresee the IDF advancing south. I don't think the people in Israel are going to tolerate Israel stopping right now. I've been to many Shiva houses. We've had over 20 in Modin alone. And the general sentiment of people is we will accept the sacrifices that we've had to make if we actually solve something this time. And I think there's going to be a very, very hard time, rightly so. I mean, if you don't eliminate Hamas at this point, you not only have you ruined your deterrence in the south, you've ruined your deterrence in the north, because there's no way that anyone's going to want to move back to the north. We evacuated about, tens of thousands of people from there, if they think that Israel doesn't have the power to get rid of the threat on its borders. And so there's really a lot at stake here if we don't advance to the south. So I predict that they will. I hope that they will, frankly, because I think we have a moral obligation to do so. If the IDF advances south, what ethically should IDF do with those who have moved south? That's a great question, Gil. So here we have run into a problem. And we started to see President Biden starting to talk about this as well. Israel forewarned and sent many Gazans to the south when they attacked the north. Where are they going to go now? So part of the moral responsibility in this issue, by the way, lies with the fact that the other bordering country, namely Egypt, refuses to take in refugees. I mean, look what happened in Syria. 1 million went to Europe. I mean, this is sort of a pretty crazy situation where you don't have any form of taking in refugees to get people out of the war zone. So there is a certain amount of ethical responsibility that goes there as well. And I suspect Israel's going to do what it can in order to minimize civilian casualties. But again, at some point, and I think we've crossed that point, the onus of responsibility goes to the other side. I mean, I don't know if we've ever had a warfare like this, where you literally have a situation. It's not just human shields anymore. It's not just people fighting within their civilians. It's fighting or staying under the civilians, underground. I mean, I'm not sure we've ever had a situation like this. So, I don't know, meaning a history of warfare. I don't know. Maybe there have been others, but it certainly is, I don't know if unprecedented, but a unique situation. And when you fight under your people are going to die, and that is the responsibility of those who place them there. But Gil, you're absolutely right. It could get really, really difficult. And that's why we have to build up our moral understanding and fortitude of this situation. And I say that, by the way, with no glee whatsoever, meaning it is a human tragedy, this phenomenon. But I don't think that makes it unethical or any less ethical, because there's a tragic loss of life on the other side with a great responsibility, a great amount of responsibility because of their leadership in wanting to fight the war this way. I hope and pray that the world will understand this to be the case as well. Not confident that the world will understand this way as well. I think a lot of that has to do with also the fact that the world has kind of confused between the laws of going to war and the laws of how you fight a war. And there's a lot of sympathy in different ways for the Palestinian cause, the nationalistic cause in general. And so people sometimes excuse the behavior and say, well, they deserve a state anyway, or Israel's wrong anyway. It's totally irrelevant to, once they've launched a war and a vicious war, right, to the fact that we need to now uproot that threat to our people. And so I think that's going to be part of the difficulty that we're going to have right now.
Rabbi Brody, one of the questions I've been wondering about is, you presented this from a halachic approach with very clear categories in terms of innocent civilians on the one hand and combatants on the other, and the differences of approaches that we can take between these two categories. Practically speaking, what I've been thinking about, perhaps from the beginning, is how do you even know who is in which category?
Yeah.
Because you are, not you, but a soldier is going door to door in search of terrorists. Are they to give a polygraph to everyone they meet? It is so impossible to. I'd like you now to really share with me what's on your heart. Do you side with the terrorists? Are you actively one? Do you just begrudgingly want all Israelis to disappear? Like, how I don't see there being any practical way of being able to determine who is who. And my follow-up question, and this is also giving me no end of strife, is to what degree does a person become lumped in together with the enemy when they are supporters of that society? They might not be shooting a rocket and they might not be taking a sword in their hands to lunge at a soldier, but they are applauding them and they are encouraging them and they are fully backing them. At what point does the innocent civilian now become tainted with the same brush because they're one of that general culture and society?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's important to clarify the distinction. The distinction is not between innocent as opposed to combatants. I don't know who's innocent. All right. And I suspect, particularly in this case, there are a lot of people that are civilians that aren't innocent, that are greatly involved in encouraging and whatnot, might hate Jews and all these things. The same way, by the way, that there are many non-combatant civilians in Israel who are very supportive of the IDF and very encouraging, right? But they don't become combatants because of that. The key distinction is between combatants and non-combatants. If you are fighting, and not just fighting, but actively supporting the military effort, right? You become, right? I mean, the actual attack effort, you become a combatant. Which means if you're cheering on, right, a shaheed, right, or you're putting up a Palestinian Hamas flag outside of your house, you might not be so innocent about these issues, but you didn't become a combatant because of that. You become a combatant when you're actively supporting the military effort. Well, I mean, supporting is doing something towards, right, that effort. Okay. And so I think that this is the key factor, that when we go door to door, and I don't know if we always have to go door to door, by the way, because at some point you're endangering your own soldiers this way, right? So you have to be always a balance of that. But the question becomes is, you shoot and target those who are fighting. The others might not be fighting, right? And they might not be, but they might be very supportive of Hamas, but that doesn't make them a target, a legitimate target. The same way, by the way, there could be fighters out there in the world, I don't know if in this case, but in other cases, who don't really believe in the cause but are forced to fight. But at that moment, the guy might not really care about the cause, but the fact is he's fighting against you. And so he's in a uniform, he's fighting against you, becomes a combatant. And so too, I think that's the really critical question is this person an active threat or not? Now, there are going to be unclear times, blurry zones. I'll give you an example. A child picks up an RPG or a gun, points it at you. Is he doing this because he really wants to kill you? Is he doing this because he's been taught? Whatever it might be. It doesn't matter. At that moment, he's a direct threat. You can shoot the child. Horrible thing, but you can shoot the child. Right? And the same thing happened, we know this already, where the IDF's in the northern Gaza, and all of a sudden a wave of women and children come running at the soldiers, widely reported here in Israel. Do you shoot these women and children? Well, the answer is no, unless you think they're hiding, right? Terrorists are coming right behind them, in which they become a legitimate target. And so that's part of the difficult balance. And in this situation, I do think we have to err on the side of protecting our soldiers. But you're right, Rabbi. I mean, it's one of the very, very difficult issues. But I don't think that because someone is sympathetic or even very supportive of Hamas, they become a combatant. Just like I don't think it's legitimate for Hamas to target Sderot, even though the people of Sderot are very sympathetic to the IDF. Right? So it goes both ways, of course. And that's why I think the distinction is not who's innocent or guilty, but rather of in war, we target those who are fighting. Right? And that's sort of how I break down that distinction of it. Now, you might say that, well, if someone who's not so innocent dies because of collateral damage, I don't feel as bad. Okay, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true. I don't know. But either way, that's not who I want to target. Gil asked a question about absolute victory, the Nazi ideology. So this is a very good question, a very hard question, because you sometimes have, and this is certainly the case in World War II, this feeling of it had to be absolute victory. It could be that that's the case. It could be that's the case in our situation, but unless you are willing to say that it's impossible for the Palestinian people, whatever it is, to reform and have something different, I don't think we want to go there. So I do think that our goal right now has to be to eliminate the threat. Now, of course, there's always this question of the morning after. Let's say Israel is successful in uprooting Hamas leadership from Gaza. What's going to happen the morning after? It's a big question. Right? It's a big question. But as long as we're not willing, and I don't see any reason for this, to sort of just try to forcibly kick out everyone out of Gaza, that'd be right, which I think we understand as to be unfathomable in a lot of different ways. We have to have some form of limits to this. But it's a scary prospect you're raising, Gil, because the ideology here is so horrific, that you sort of wonder, is it ever going to be possible? Which is why I always hold out the belief in my fourth principle, which says that we should believe in the redemption of the world. It's always important to maintain hope for a better future, but while being realistic about the present that we have today.
So on that note, Rabbi, being realistic about the present, if I may, there was a recent poll taken since October 7th by the Arab World for Research and Development Organization, AWRAD, and they took a poll in Gaza and the West Bank, and it was about 633 people, and they found that 75% of the people polled support the October 7th massacre. That the reasons given, the biggest reason given for why they support the action was the attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque. Wasn't the siege, wasn't occupation, it was the attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque, which was mythical. But siege was definitely, the blockade of Gaza was definitely cited. Yeah. And they supported a national unity government, including Hamas, to be in power after the war is over, with more supporting Hamas alone than supporting Fatah alone.
Yeah.
So
I'm not optimistic, Richard. I'm not optimistic.
yeah.
I'm not optimistic, but it's always important to hope, believe in the possibility of a better day. But in the meantime, to fight, given the reality, and that's the reality right now. So I don't know what exactly the numbers are, what they'll be, and the support, but there's no doubt we have a very, very difficult situation, which is why we need to maintain our moral fortitude right now.
I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Brody. I know that your time is precious, and it truly was so worthwhile having you here this evening. Thank you so much. I know your day is busy. I know your commitments are many, and there's a variety of various juggling that you are doing. And I just want to acknowledge and thank you so much for coming on this evening and for presenting this food for thought, and delivered in the way that only you can deliver it, with clarity, with taking very complex issues and making them presentable. Friends, I hope that you enjoyed today's presentation. And if you did, I want to let you know that we are having a second, this is a two-part series, and the second class will be this same time next week, Wednesday, 12 noon in Eastern Standard Time, 7 p.m. Israel time, or wherever else in the world you may be. And the subject is going to be captive dilemmas, then and now halachic perspectives on freeing hostages. And this is going to be extremely important and hopefully deeply insightful, and will allow us much clarity. So we hope to see you back next week. And thank you so much, everybody. Have a good day. Have a good evening. Be well.
Thank you.